Elena froze in the doorway of the hotel bar, watching her husband Marcus laugh intimately with a stunning blonde who definitely wasn't her. The woman's perfectly manicured hand rested on his arm, and for a moment, Elena felt the sharp sting of betrayal until she remembered their marriage certificate was nothing more than an expensive piece of paper. 6 months earlier, Elena had been drowning in student debt, working 3 jobs just to keep her head above water. Her master's degree in art therapy felt worthless when she couldn't even afford groceries. That's when her roommate mentioned a bizarre opportunity. A wealthy tech entrepreneur needed a wife on paper to satisfy his conservative board of directors. The compensation, $2 million for 2 years of pretending. Marcus Chen had built his company from nothing, but his traditional Chinese-American board insisted that a family man would be more stable, more trustworthy with their investments. At 32, he'd never had time for real relationships, too absorbed in coding and late-night strategy sessions. A contract marriage seemed like the perfect solution: clean, professional, and temporary. Their first meeting had been awkward, conducted in a sterile conference room with lawyers present. Marcus was handsome in an understated way, with intelligent dark eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and an almost painful shyness that made him stumble over words when discussing the terms. Elena found his nervousness endearing, so different from the confident men who usually ignored her existence. "We'll maintain separate bedrooms," he'd explained, not meeting her eyes. "Attend company functions together. Maybe a few public outings for appearances. Nothing intimate required." Elena had nodded, fighting down an unexpected flutter of disappointment. The contract was generous: full financial support, a beautiful penthouse apartment, and freedom to pursue her career. She'd signed without hesitation, telling herself this was just business. The wedding ceremony had been small, attended only by his business partner David and Elena's sister Sophia, who'd flown in from Portland. Marcus had worn a perfectly tailored navy suit that emphasized his lean frame, and Elena had chosen a simple cream dress that made her feel beautiful for the first time in months. When he'd slipped the platinum band onto her finger, his hands had trembled slightly, and she'd wondered if he was as affected by the moment as she was. Their first few weeks together had been carefully choreographed politeness. Marcus left for work before she woke up, leaving perfectly prepared coffee and sometimes a pastry from her favorite bakery. Details that surprised her with their thoughtfulness. Evenings were spent in different rooms, him coding in his study while she painted. In the sunroom he'd converted into an art studio without being asked. But slowly, inevitably, their rigid boundaries began to soften. Late one night, Elena had found Marcus in the kitchen, exhaustion written across his features as he stared blankly at his laptop screen. Without thinking, she'd made him tea and asked about his work. His face had lit up as he explained his latest project, hands gesturing animatedly. And Elena had found herself genuinely fascinated not just by his intelligence, but by the passion that transformed his entire demeanor. That night had marked a shift. They began eating breakfast together, sharing stories about their childhoods, their dreams, their fears. Elena learned that Marcus had been a lonely child, pouring himself into computers to escape his parents' constant fighting. He discovered that Elena's art was her way of processing the world's pain, that she'd chosen therapy because she couldn't bear to see others suffer alone. The attraction between them grew like a slow-burning flame, manifesting in lingering glances, accidental touches that lasted a heartbeat too long, and conversations that stretched deep into the night. Elena found herself looking forward to his return from work, her pulse quickening when she heard his key in the lock. Their first company function had been a revelation. Marcus, usually so reserved, had stayed close to her side all evening, his hand warm and possessive on the small of her back. When colleagues praised his lovely wife, the pride in his eyes had seemed genuinely real. Dancing together at the end of the night, bodies pressed close, Elena had felt the careful walls they'd built beginning to crumble. The pretense became harder to maintain with each passing day. What had started as a business arrangement was evolving into something neither had expected, and both were too afraid to acknowledge. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday evening, when Elena discovered Marcus had been quietly paying her sister's medical bills. Sophia had been diagnosed with lupus, and the treatments were bankrupting her small family. "Why didn't you tell me?" Elena confronted him, the paid invoices trembling in her hands. Marcus looked up from his laptop, guilt written across his features. "You were worried sick about her. I could help, so I did. But this isn't part of our contract." "Forget the damn contract," he'd snapped, standing abruptly. "Sophia is your family, which makes her important to me. I don't do things because a piece of paper tells me to." The raw emotion in his voice had stolen Elena's breath. Before she could stop herself, she'd crossed the room and kissed him, pouring months of suppressed longing into the contact. Marcus had responded immediately, his arms wrapping around her waist as he pulled her closer, deepening the kiss with a desperation that matched her own. They'd made love that night with a tenderness that spoke of months of careful observation, of learning each other's habits and preferences without meaning to. Marcus had worshipped her body with patient hands and reverent kisses, mapping every curve and hollow as if memorizing her. Elena had traced the lean muscles of his chest, marveling at how perfectly they fit together, how right it felt to be. In his arms, afterward, lying tangled in his sheets, Marcus had traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "This changes everything." He'd whispered against her hair. Elena had pressed closer, inhaling his familiar scent of cedar and coffee. "Does it have to?" But change it did. Their careful distance evaporated overnight, replaced by stolen moments of intimacy that felt more real than anything Elena had ever experienced. Morning coffee became an excuse to share lingering kisses over the counter. Marcus would find reasons to work from home, pulling Elena into his lap during video calls, his hands sliding under her shirt while he maintained perfect professional composure on screen. Their public appearances took on new authenticity. At charity galas and board dinners, they moved like a real couple, anticipating each other's needs, sharing private jokes and meaningful glances. Marcus's colleagues commented on how happy he seemed, how the marriage had clearly been good for him. The physical intimacy deepened their emotional connection. Marcus began sharing his fears about the company, about living up to his father's expectations, about being worthy of the success he'd achieved. Elena opened up about her struggles with self-worth, her fear that she'd never be more than a struggling artist dependent on others. "You're brilliant," Marcus had told her one night, holding her close after she'd confessed her insecurities. "Your art moves people, heals them. That's worth more than any algorithm I've ever written." 3 months into their evolving relationship, they attended Marcus's college roommate's wedding, watching the couple exchange vows. Elena had felt a sharp pang of longing. Their own ceremony had been a performance, but sitting beside Marcus, his thumb stroking over her wedding ring, she'd found herself imagining what it would feel like to marry him for real. That night in their hotel room, their lovemaking had been different, deeper, more intense, charged with unspoken emotions neither was ready to voice. Marcus had held her afterward with desperate tenderness, as if afraid she might disappear. "Elena," he'd started to say something, then stopped, pressing his face into her neck instead. She'd felt the words hanging between them, the confession they were both too scared to make. What they had was beautiful, but it was also built on a foundation of deception. The contract still existed, with its clear end date. His board still believed their marriage was real, and Elena's 2 years of financial security still depended on maintaining the lie. As autumn turned to winter, they fell into a rhythm that felt increasingly like a real marriage. Marcus surprised her with art supplies from Paris. Elena learned to cook his favorite dishes, filling their home with warmth and laughter. They made love with increasing passion and tenderness, their bodies learning to communicate what their hearts couldn't yet say aloud. But underneath the happiness, tension simmered. They were living a double life, pretending their feelings were fake while privately nurturing something very real. The weight of the deception grew heavier with each passing day, each loving gesture that had to be explained away as part of their performance. Winter brought both deeper intimacy and growing complications. Elena had moved into Marcus's bedroom permanently, though they maintained the pretense of separate spaces when his housekeeper visited. Their nights were filled with passionate encounters that left them breathless and clinging to each other, afraid to examine too closely what was happening between them. Marcus had become more affectionate in public, his touches lingering, his smiles genuine, At his company's holiday party, he'd pulled Elena onto the dance floor for every slow song, holding her close enough that she could feel his heartbeat against her chest. When his business partner David had joked about the honeymoon phase lasting, Marcus had simply smiled and spun Elena closer, pressing a soft kiss to her temple. "You two are disgusting," David had laughed, but his eyes were warm with approval. I haven't seen Marcus this happy since, well, ever. Later that night, in the privacy of their penthouse, Marcus had made love to Elena with an intensity that bordered on desperation. His hands had roamed her body with possessive tenderness, his whispered endearments becoming more frequent, more heartfelt. "You're so beautiful," he'd murmured against her skin, his lips trailing fire down her throat. "I never expected what?" Elena had gasped, arching beneath his touch. But Marcus had only answered with deeper kisses, his body saying what his words couldn't. The holidays brought new challenges. Elena's family invited them to Portland for Christmas, and maintaining their facade became increasingly difficult. Sophia, still weak from her treatments, but improving thanks to Marcus's financial help, had pulled Elena aside on Christmas Eve. "You're glowing," her sister had observed. "Marriage agrees with you," Elena had forced a smile, guilt twisting in her stomach. "It's complicated. Love usually is," Sophia had replied knowingly. "But Marcus looks at you like you hung the moon. Whatever complications you're dealing with, don't let fear make the decision for you." That night, sharing Elena's childhood bedroom, Marcus had held her close as snow fell outside the window. "Your family is wonderful," he'd whispered into the darkness. "They like you too. Sophia especially." Elena had turned in his arms, studying his profile in the moonlight. "She said you visited her when I was at that art therapy conference in Seattle." Marcus had nodded, suddenly tense. "She was having a bad day. I thought she could use some company." The simple kindness of the gesture had overwhelmed Elena. This wasn't part of their contract, wasn't performance for any audience. This was Marcus, genuinely caring for the people she loved because he what? Loved her. Back in their city apartment, the new year brought increased pressure. The board was pushing for Marcus to expand internationally, which would mean more travel, more scrutiny, more public appearances as a happily married couple. During a particularly intense board meeting in January, Elena had sat in the gallery, watching Marcus field questions about his personal life with practiced ease. "Marriage has given me stability," he'd told the room full of suits. "Having Elena's support allows me to take calculated risks I might not have considered before." The words were true, but the foundation they were built on remained a lie. That evening, Elena had confronted him about it. "What happens when they find out?" she'd asked, pacing their living room. "What happens to your company, your reputation?" Marcus had pulled her into his arms, stilling her restless movement. "They won't find out. And in 10 months when our contract expires, we'll figure something out." "Like what? Fake a divorce? Pretend we've grown apart?" The pain in Marcus's eyes had been unmistakable. "Is that what you want?" Elena had searched his face, seeing her own fears reflected back. "I don't know what I want anymore." This was supposed to be simple. "Nothing about you has ever been simple," Marcus had replied, cupping her face gently. "You've turned my entire world upside down, Elena. Made me feel things I didn't know I was capable of." They'd made love that night with desperate passion, as if trying to anchor themselves to something real in a relationship built on pretense. Elena had memorized every touch, every whispered endearment, storing them against an uncertain future. February brought Valentine's Day and another test of their evolving relationship. Marcus had surprised Elena with a weekend in Napa Valley, booking a private villa where they could drop their guards completely, away from the city, from the pressures of their public performance. They'd spent 2 days lost in each other. "I love watching you paint," Marcus had said, finding Elena in the villa's garden where she'd set up her easel to capture the vineyard at sunset. He'd wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "You're distracting me," Elena had laughed, but she'd leaned back against his chest, savoring his warmth. "Good. I like having your attention." That night, they'd made love under the stars on the villa's private terrace, their bodies moving together with perfect synchronization. In the aftermath, lying skin to skin on the outdoor bed, Elena had almost said the words hovering in her heart, but fear had held her tongue. The knowledge that their entire relationship was built on a contract that would expire in 8 months. Spring brought unexpected complications in the form of Vivian Chenno relation. Despite the shared surname Marcus's ex-girlfriend from graduate school, she appeared at a company mixer in April, stunning and confident, with the kind of polished beauty that made Elena feel suddenly inadequate in her simple black dress. Marcus, Vivian had called across the crowded room, her voice carrying that particular tone of intimacy reserved for former lovers. "I heard congratulations are in order." Elena had felt Marcus tense beside her, his hand tightening almost imperceptibly. On her waist, "Vivian, I didn't know you were back in the city. Just transferred here with Goldman Sachs. I'm heading their new tech investment division." Vivian's smile was perfect, professional, and somehow predatory as her gaze shifted to Elena. "And you must be the wife I've heard so much about." The evening had proceeded normally on the surface, but Elena had noticed the way Vivian watched them, her sharp eyes cataloging every interaction, every gesture. There was something calculating in her observation that made Elena's skin crawl. Over the following weeks, Vivian appeared at several more company events, always perfectly dressed, always armed with insider knowledge about Marcus's business that impressed the board members. She'd make subtle comments about their shared history, inside jokes that excluded Elena, memories of a relationship that had clearly meant more to Marcus than he'd initially let on. "She was important to you," Elena had confronted him after a particularly uncomfortable dinner where Vivian had dominated the conversation. With reminiscences about their time at MIT. Marcus had set down his wine glass carefully. "We dated for 2 years in graduate school. It ended badly." "How badly?" "She wanted things I couldn't give her then. Marriage, commitment, a future I wasn't ready for." Marcus had reached for Elena's hand. "I was different then, younger, more selfish. I didn't understand what love actually meant." The implication in his words had made Elena's heart race, but before she could respond, his phone had buzzed with a work emergency that pulled him away. As April turned to May, Vivian's presence became more aggressive. She'd corner Marcus at events, touching his arm while discussing business, laughing too loudly at his jokes, positioning herself in photos with strategic intimacy. Elena watched it all with growing unease, recognizing the tactics of a woman who knew exactly what she wanted and had no scruples about getting it. The breaking point came at the company's annual gala, a black-tie affair that Elena had been looking forward to. She'd bought a stunning emerald dress that brought out her eyes and made Marcus's pupils dilate. When she'd emerged from their bedroom, "You're gorgeous," he'd breathed, pulling her close for a kiss that had nearly convinced her to skip the event entirely. But at the gala, Vivian had arrived in a red dress that screamed expensive and confidence, and she'd made her move. During the charity auction, when Marcus had bid on a weekend in Tuscany, Vivian had laughingly outbid him, then suggested they share it for old time's sake. Elena had excused herself to the ladies' room, needing air and space to process the sick feeling in her stomach. She'd been touching up her lipstick when Vivian had entered, her reflection appearing in the mirror beside Elena's. "You're handling this all very well," Vivian had said conversationally, checking her own perfect appearance. "Handling what?" "Being married to Marcus. It can't be easy, given the circumstances." Elena had turned slowly, every instinct screaming danger. "I'm not sure what you mean." Vivian's smile had been sharp as a blade. "Oh, please, we both know this. Marriage is a business arrangement. Marcus always was practical to a fault. I assume the board insisted on a wife before approving the international expansion." Elena's blood had turned to ice, but she'd kept her expression carefully neutral. "I think you're confused." "Am I?" "Because I've done my research, Elena. Art therapy, master's degree, crushing student debt, no family money. Then suddenly you're living in a penthouse, wearing designer dresses, and married to one of the city's most eligible bachelors." Vivian had stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "The math isn't difficult." Even if that were true, Elena had managed, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "It wouldn't be any of your business, but it is my business, because, unlike you, I actually love Marcus. I made a mistake letting him go before, but I'm not making that mistake again." Vivian's mask had slipped, revealing raw ambition and jealousy underneath. "Your little contract won't last forever, and when it's over, I'll be here." Elena had left the bathroom on shaking legs, Vivian's words echoing in her mind. Back in the ballroom, she'd watch Marcus laugh at something David was saying. So handsome in his tuxedo, so completely unaware that their carefully constructed world was beginning to crumble. That night, Elena had made love to Marcus with desperate intensity, trying to memorize every sensation, every whispered endearment, storing them up against an uncertain future. Because if Vivian could see through their pretense so easily, how long before others did the same? The end came swiftly, brutally, and in the most public way possible. Marcus's company was hosting its quarterly board meeting, with Elena in attendance as the supportive wife. When Vivian made her final play, she'd arrived with a folder full of documents, their original marriage contract, bank records showing Elena's student loan payments, even photos of them from before they'd met. Clearly separate lives that had intersected too conveniently. "I think the board has a right to know about potential fraud in leadership," Vivian had announced during the financial review, her voice carrying perfectly across the silent boardroom, especially when it involves misrepresentation of personal circumstances that influenced major business decisions. Elena had watched in horror as Vivian laid out their deception. With clinical precision, the marriage certificate with its suspicious timing, the financial arrangements that looked exactly like what they were, payment for services rendered, the separate bedrooms documented by the building's housekeeping staff, every piece of evidence that proved their marriage was a carefully orchestrated business transaction. Marcus had gone pale, then rigid with fury. "This is completely inappropriate, Vivian. My personal life has no bearing on, doesn't it?" Board Chairman William Chen, a distant cousin, who'd never approved of Marcus's unconventional methods, had interrupted. "We approved the international expansion specifically because your marriage demonstrated stability and commitment. If that marriage is fraudulent..." The room had erupted in heated discussion, board members demanding explanations, lawyers being summoned, and Marcus trying desperately to control the damage. Elena had sat frozen, watching their carefully constructed world collapse in real time. But then something unexpected had happened. Marcus had stood up, his voice cutting through the chaos with quiet authority. "Yes," he'd said simply, "the marriage started as a contract. Elena needed financial help, and I needed to satisfy the board's requirements. But that's not what it is now." He'd turned to look at Elena, his eyes blazing with an emotion that took her breath away. "What started as a business arrangement became the most real thing in my life. Elena isn't just my wife on paper, she's my partner, my anchor, the woman I love more than I thought possible." Elena's heart had stopped beating. In front of a room full of his colleagues, his future hanging in the balance, Marcus was choosing truth over professional safety. "I love her," he'd continued, never breaking eye contact with Elena. "I love her kindness, her talent, her strength. I love how she makes me want to be better, how she brought light into a life I didn't realize was dark. And if that means I lose this company, if it means starting over, then that's what I'll do. Because losing Elena would be losing everything that actually matters." The boardroom had fallen silent. Elena had felt tears streaming down her face as she stood up, walking around the conference table to stand beside Marcus. "I love him too," she'd said clearly, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "What started as a contract became real somewhere along the way. Marcus isn't just my husband on paper. He's the best man I've ever known, and I'd rather face uncertainty with him than security without him." The aftermath had been swift and decisive. The board had voted to remove Marcus as CEO, their conservative sensibilities unable to overlook the deception, regardless of genuine feelings, that had developed. Vivian had gotten her revenge, but the hollow victory had clearly not brought her the satisfaction she'd expected as she watched Marcus and Elena stand united against the storm. 6 months later, Elena stood in the kitchen of their smaller but warmer apartment, watching Marcus work at the dining table that doubled as his desk. He'd started his own company, and though money was tighter and the future uncertain, they'd never been happier. They'd married again, a real ceremony this time, small and intimate, with only family and close friends present. Any regrets? Marcus asked, looking up from his laptop as if he'd read her thoughts. Elena considered the question seriously. They'd lost the penthouse, the financial security, the easy path forward, but they'd gained something infinitely more valuable, a love built on truth rather than contracts, a partnership based on choice rather than necessity. Just one, she said, moving to stand behind his chair, wrapping her arms around his shoulders. I regret that it took a crisis for us to be honest about our feelings. Marcus tilted his head back to look at her, smiling with the easy contentment that had replaced his former anxiety. Maybe we needed the pretense to feel safe enough to fall in love. Elena leaned down to kiss him, tasting truth and possibility. On his lips, outside their window, the city sparkled with evening lights, full of potential and new beginnings. Their love story had started with a lie, built on deception, and been exposed in the most public way possible. But from those ashes, something real and beautiful had grown. They'd chosen each other when they had nothing left to lose, and that choice had made all the difference. What do you think? Can genuine love truly develop from a foundation of deception? Or does the artificial beginning always taint what comes after? When Elena and Marcus chose love over security, were they being romantic idealists or finally becoming authentic versions of themselves?